The drop pod screamed through the atmosphere like a falling star, trailing fire and smoke across the purple twilight sky of the colony world humanity called New Verde. Mira Chen stood in the wheat fields behind her family's research station and watched the burning streak arc overhead, her dark hair whipping in the warm evening breeze. She knew what it was. Everyone in the colonies knew about the Vrix Imperium and their invasion fleets that moved slowly but steadily through human space, consuming worlds and crushing resistance. The 12-year-old girl had heard the emergency broadcasts just an hour ago, the ones that made her parents rush to pack their research and head to the main settlement 20 kilometers away. They had told her to come with them, but Mira had insisted on staying to feed the animals and lock down the equipment, promising she would follow in the morning. Her parents trusted her. She was responsible and smart, and knew how to handle herself. On the frontier. Now she watched the pod impact somewhere beyond the western hills, and felt her stomach tighten with a mix of fear and something else. Something she recognized as the same feeling she got when her parents brought home a new alien specimen to study. Curiosity. The Vrix were sending bioweapons ahead of their fleets now, according to the colonial defense reports. Creatures designed and grown in labs, engineered to hunt humans by tracking their fear and body heat, killing them before the invasion ships even arrived. Mira climbed onto the roof of the equipment shed using the ladder her father had installed for telescope viewing, and pulled out her scanner, the one she used for tracking the local wildlife when helping with her parents' research. The crash site registered 3 kilometers away in a shallow valley where the native grass grew tall and thick. She should report it and wait for the colonial security forces. Safe choice, the smart choice, the one any reasonable person would make. Instead, Mira climbed down and went to the garage where the family kept their all-terrain rover. The twin moons were rising by the time she reached the crash site, and the pod sat embedded in the torn earth like a massive black seed, still steaming from atmospheric entry. Scorch marks radiated outward in a starburst pattern, and the native grass had been flattened in a wide circle. Mira cut the rover's engine and sat there for a long moment, her hands gripping the steering controls while her heart hammered against her ribs. The pod's side had already cracked open, and something massive had dragged itself out, leaving a trail of disturbed soil leading toward a cluster of rock formations. She grabbed her medical kit, the one her mother had taught her to use for treating injured animals, and followed the trail. What she found took her breath away. 4 meters long, with 6 powerful limbs, ending in curved claws that could tear through metal. Its body was covered in overlapping plates of chitinous armor that gleamed with bioluminescent patterns, blues and greens pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. Sensory tendrils emerged from its head, each one as thick as Mira's arm, and tipped with what looked like delicate fronds that tasted the air. It was beautiful in a terrible alien way, designed for killing with every line of its muscular frame. And it was hurt. One of its rear limbs was bent at an awkward angle, and green fluid, blood, Mira assumed, leaked from cracks in its armor plating. The creature's tendrils locked onto her position immediately, and its whole body tensed, those bioluminescent patterns flaring bright with what might have been aggression or alarm. Mira did something that would have made any survival expert call her insane. She sat down cross-legged on the ground, about 10 meters away, and opened her medical kit slowly, keeping her movements smooth and deliberate. "Hey there," she said softly, using the same tone she employed with frightened animals. "You're hurt, and probably confused, and definitely not supposed to crash land like that." The creature's tendrils waved in complex patterns, and she could see its multiple eyes, 6 of them arranged around its wedge-shaped head, focusing on her with unsettling intelligence. It made a sound, something between a hiss and a low rumble that she felt in her chest. "I know you are probably made to hunt people like me," Mira continued, slowly pulling out antiseptic spray and wound sealant. "But right now you need help, and I happen to be pretty good at this sort of thing." She had helped her parents treat dozens of alien creatures over the years, learning how to read body language and stress signals across wildly different biologies. This thing radiated pain and confusion, but also something else. Something that made her think its programming wasn't working quite right. Maybe the crash had damaged it, or maybe the Vrix hadn't perfected their weapons yet. Either way, it wasn't attacking, and that gave her hope. Mira stood slowly and took 3 careful steps forward, watching the creature's reaction. Its tendrils tracked her movement, but it didn't lunge or strike. 3 more steps. The bioluminescent patterns shifted to a slower pulse, and the creature's body language changed subtly, some of the tension easing from its coiled muscles. "That's it," she whispered. "I'm just going to look at that leg, okay?" When she was close enough to touch it, she knelt down and examined the injured limb, noting how the chitin had cracked along natural seam lines. The joint was dislocated, but not broken. Something she could actually help with if the creature would let her. She looked up and found herself staring into one of those alien eyes. She could see the strange geometric pattern of its iris. "This is going to hurt," she said honestly, "but it'll feel better after." The creature made that rumbling sound again, and Mira took it as permission. She braced herself and pulled on the limb with techniques she'd learned from her mother, feeling the joint pop back into place. The creature's whole body shuddered, and its tendrils lashed once, but it didn't strike her. Instead, it went very still while she sprayed antiseptic on the cracks in its armor and applied wound sealant to stop the bleeding. The whole process took 20 minutes, and by the end, Mira was sitting against the creature's warm side, feeling the strange texture of its plating against her back. "I'm going to call you Shade," she said, exhaustion suddenly hitting her, "because you're dark like a shadow, and I think we're going to be friends." Above them, the stars were coming out, and somewhere in orbit, the Vrix fleet was probably headed, preparing to deploy more of these weapons. But here in this valley, with this impossible creature that should have killed her, Mira Chen felt something she couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of understanding that humanity's greatest strength had never been their weapons or their technology. It was their bizarre willingness to see potential friends in the strangest places. Morning light filtered through the gaps in the barn walls, where Mira had convinced Shade to shelter for the night, casting stripes of gold across the creature's bioluminescent plating. She had dozed fitfully against the alien's warm side, waking every hour or so to check that it was still breathing and that the wound sealant was holding. Now she sat up and stretched, wincing at the stiffness in her back, while Shade's sensory tendrils tracked her movement with what she was starting to recognize as curiosity rather than threat assessment. The creature had followed her back to the research station in the dark hours before dawn, moving with a strange limping grace on its injured leg. It had balked at entering the barn at first, but Mira had simply walked inside and waited, speaking to it in that same calm voice until it had ducked its massive head under the doorframe and settled onto the hay-covered floor. She checked her communicator and found 17 urgent messages from her parents, demanding to know why she hadn't arrived at the settlement. There were also 3 emergency broadcasts about the bioweapon deployment and warnings that colonial security drones were sweeping the area. Mira bit her lip and made a decision that would change everything. She recorded a message to her parents, keeping her voice steady and calm. "Mom, Dad, I'm fine, but I need you to trust me on something really important," she began, glancing at Shade, who was watching her with those unsettling, multifaceted eyes. "I found one of the Vrix weapons, and it's hurt, and I've been helping it. And I know that sounds crazy, but something's different about this one." She explained about the crash and the injuries, and how the creature hadn't attacked, despite having multiple opportunities. "I think the deployment went wrong," she continued. "Or maybe there's something about how they program these things that doesn't account for humans, actually. Approaching them without fear. I don't know yet, but I need time to figure it out." Mira sent the message, and then turned her attention to more immediate concerns. Shade needed food, and she had no idea what a bioengineered killing machine actually ate. She started with water, filling a trough and dragging it closer to where the creature rested. Shade's tendrils investigated the water cautiously, before the creature lowered its head and drank, a long, flexible tongue emerging to lap at the liquid. Encouraged, Mira raided the research station's supply of preserved alien proteins, samples her parents had collected from various ecosystems. Shade accepted some and rejected others, showing clear preferences that suggested sophisticated sensory systems. When she offered it some of the synthesized nutrients her parents used for feeding captive specimens, the creature's bioluminescent patterns flared bright with what might have been pleasure or approval. "You like the good stuff," Mira said, smiling despite the surreal nature of feeding breakfast to something designed to kill her. "We'll have to figure out a sustainable diet if you're staying." The barn door burst open, and Mira's heart jumped into her throat. 2 colonial security drones hovered there, weapons arrays trained on Shade, who immediately went into a defensive crouch, protective plating sliding into attack configuration. "No!" Mira shouted, throwing herself between the drones and the creature. "Don't shoot, it's not hostile." The drone's speakers crackled with the voice of a security officer. "Mira Chen, step away from the bioweapon immediately. We are authorized to neutralize the threat." "It's not a threat," she insisted, keeping her arms spread wide. "Look at it. If it wanted to kill me, I'd already be dead. But instead it let me treat its injuries, and it followed me home and slept in the barn." There was a long pause while whoever was on the other side, controlling the drones, presumably tried to process this information. "The creature is exhibiting non-standard behavior," a different voice said, female and crisp with authority. "We're sending a xenobiology team. Keep it calm if you can, but maintain distance." The drones backed out of the barn slowly, and Mira let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to find Shade, still in its defensive posture, tendrils extended and patterns pulsing rapid amber. "It's okay," she said softly, approaching despite knowing she should probably keep back. "They're gone for now. You're safe." The creature's patterns gradually slowed, and it settled back onto the hay, though its eyes never left the doorway. Within an hour, the research station was surrounded by military vehicles and hastily erected containment barriers. Mira's parents arrived in a transport, and her mother practically tackled her with a hug, while her father stared at Shade with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of xenobiology had just been turned upside down. "Sweetheart, what were you thinking?" her mother asked, checking her over for injuries. "I was thinking that something made to kill on instinct shouldn't be able to override that programming," Mira replied. "But Shade did. It chose not to hurt me, even though every design element of its body is built for hunting humans." Her father approached Shade slowly, scanner in hand, and the creature watched him, but made no aggressive moves. "Remarkable," he breathed, reading the data. "Its neural patterns are fragmenting. The kill protocols are being overwritten by something else entirely." A woman in a colonial military uniform entered the barn, flanked by scientists carrying equipment. She introduced herself as Commander Okoye and explained that they needed to quarantine both Mira and the creature for study. "This could be a trick," she said bluntly, "or a malfunction that corrects itself. We can't risk it going active in a populated area." Mira wanted to argue, but she understood the logic. She agreed to the quarantine on one condition, that she be allowed to stay with Shade. The commander looked like she wanted to refuse, but Mira's father intervened. "If the creature has bonded with my daughter, and the evidence suggests it has, separating them could trigger the aggressive programming you're worried about," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades studying alien behavior. "Let them stay together under controlled conditions." They were transported to a research facility on the outskirts of the main settlement, installed in a large observation chamber, with reinforced walls and constant monitoring. Shade was agitated during the transport, but calmed when Mira sat beside it and talked about nothing in particular, just keeping up a steady stream of words. The scientists were fascinated and terrified, in equal measure. They watched through observation windows as Mira fed Shade and cleaned its wounds, and eventually fell asleep, reading from her tablet, while leaning against the creature's side. Security footage from that night would later become famous across human space. A small human girl, curled trustingly against a bioweapon's warm bulk, while the creature's tendrils formed a protective cage around her sleeping form, its bioluminescent patterns pulsing in slow, gentle rhythms. The Vrix had designed Shade to be a perfect predator of humans, programmed to track fear pheromones and terminate targets with ruthless efficiency. But they hadn't accounted for a human who approached with curiosity instead of terror, who offered help instead of harm, who saw a hurt creature instead of a monster. And they certainly hadn't programmed their weapon for the possibility that it might choose companionship over carnage. The quarantine facility hummed with activity as scientists worked around the clock to understand what had happened to the Vrix bioweapon, though Mira preferred to think of it as understanding Shade rather than studying a malfunctioning weapon. She sat in the observation chamber, completing her schoolwork on a tablet, while Shade dozed nearby, its breathing slow and steady. It had been 5 days since the crash, and the creature showed no signs of reverting to hostile programming. In fact, the opposite seemed to be happening. Shade's behavior was becoming increasingly social and responsive. When Mira worked on math problems, the creature would position itself so she could lean against its warm side. When she ate meals, Shade would watch with what appeared to be interest, sometimes making soft clicking sounds that the xenolinguistics team was trying to decode. Dr. Reeves, the lead researcher, entered the chamber with her usual escort of armed guards. Was a stern woman, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Mira, we need to run more tests on your biochemistry," she said, pulling up a holographic display. "We're finding something unusual in the pheromone analysis." Mira looked up from her tablet, careful not to disturb Shade's resting position. "What kind of unusual?" she asked. "You're producing elevated levels of oxytocin when you interact with the creature," Dr. Reeves explained, gesturing at charts and graphs that meant little to Mira. "Along with other bonding hormones, the same neurochemical cocktail humans produce when caring for pets or interacting with loved ones." "So I like Shade," Mira said with a shrug. "That's not weird. It's actually pretty friendly once you get to know it." Dr. Reeves' expression tightened, with something like frustration, or maybe concern. "The creature is responding to those chemical signals," she continued. "Its sensory systems were designed to track humans' fear pheromones and stress hormones, but when exposed to bonding signals instead, the programming is interpreting them as safety markers rather than target indicators." Shade's tendrils stirred and wrapped loosely around Mira's arm, not restraining, but present in a way that felt protective. "You're saying my emotions are literally reprogramming it?" Mira asked, fascinated despite herself. "In simplified terms, yes," the scientist confirmed. "The weapon's neural architecture was built to be adaptive and responsive to human biochemical signals, but the Vrix only anticipated fear and aggression. They didn't account for compassion." That night, Mira lay awake thinking about what Dr. Reeves had said. If her emotional state could change Shade's programming, could other humans do the same with other Vrix weapons? The question became urgent 2 days later, when the emergency sirens wailed across the colony. Commander Okoye burst into the observation chamber. With a security detail, "We've detected 17 more drop pods entering the atmosphere," she announced, her face grim. "They're targeting population centers this time. We're evacuating civilians to hardened shelters." Mira scrambled to her feet, while Shade rose to its full height, patterns flashing rapid orange. "Let me try," she said quickly, the idea forming even as she spoke. "Let me go to one of the landing sites. If I can approach another creature the way I approach Shade, maybe it'll respond the same way. Absolutely not, the commander said flatly. You're a child, and those things are designed killers. Shade could be an anomaly or a malfunction. Or it could be proof that the weapons can be turned, Mira's father interjected, having followed the commander into the chamber. If there's even a chance that Mira's approach could work, we have to try. Conventional weapons barely scratch these things, and we don't have enough firepower to stop 17 of them. The argument raged for 20 minutes, while alarms continued to sound and evacuation orders echoed through the facility. Finally, Commander Okoye made a decision that would either save the colony or doom them all. One attempt, she said, pointing at Mira with steel in her voice. You approach one creature at a controlled landing site with full military support standing by. If it shows any aggression, we neutralize it immediately and you evacuate. They chose a drop zone in an open field, away from population centers, and set up a perimeter with heavy weapons and combat vehicles. Mira rode in an armored transport, with Shade crouched beside her, the creature's agitation obvious in its rapid pattern shifts and restless movement. You need to stay calm, she told it softly, rubbing the ridge of chitin along its neck. If another one of your kind sees you acting peaceful, maybe it'll understand. The drop pods screamed down through the clouds, and impacted with enough force to shake the ground. Soldiers tensed behind their weapons, while Mira walked toward the crash site, with Shade at her side. Her heart was trying to break through her ribcage, but she kept her breathing steady, and thought about how she'd felt when first approaching Shade. Curious and concerned, rather than afraid. The new creature emerged from its pod in a blur of lethal grace. It was similar to Shade in basic structure, but larger and unmarred by crash damage. Its patterns blazed aggressive red, and its sensory tendrils locked onto Mira immediately. This was the moment everything would be decided. Mira sat down on the ground 20 meters from the creature, and pulled out a ration bar from her pocket. She broke it in half, and ate one piece slowly, while offering the other toward the newcomer. Shade moved between them, and made a series of complex sounds, patterns shifting through blues and greens. Tilted its head, tendrils weaving in response. It took a step forward, and Mira heard weapons charging behind her. Hold fire, Commander Okoye's voice came through speakers. Let it play out. Another step, and the creature was close enough that Mira could see the geometric patterns in its eyes. She extended her hand with the ration bar, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening. The creature's tendril reached out and delicately took the food, pulling it back to investigate. Mira talked to it the way she talked to Shade, explaining what the food was and how she'd helped Shade when it was hurt, and how there was no need for violence. The creature ate the ration bar. Then it settled onto the ground in front of her, patterns gradually shifting from aggressive red to curious amber. Mira reached out and touched its plating, feeling the warmth and the subtle vibration of its breathing. Behind her she heard someone, maybe her mother, sobbing. With relief. We need to try this at other sites, Mira said, looking back at Commander Okoye. Right now, before the other creatures have time to start hunting. What followed was the strangest military operation in human history. Volunteers, mostly young people who'd grown up on frontier worlds handling alien wildlife, were deployed to landing sites across the colony. Each one approached their assigned bioweapon with food, calm voices, and genuine compassion. Not all attempts succeeded, and 3 volunteers died when their assigned creatures attacked, before the bonding process could begin. But 12 of the 17 weapons were successfully turned, their programming fragmenting under the unexpected assault of human kindness. The VRIX commanders in orbit watched in horror as their perfect killing machines began protecting the very targets they were supposed to eliminate. When VRIX ground troops landed, expecting to find populations already decimated, they instead faced those same bioweapons defending human positions with ferocious efficiency. Shade fought beside Mira during the brief ground engagement, its powerful limbs tearing through Vrick's armor, while she coordinated defensive positions from a protected bunker. The invasion force retreated after 6 hours, unable to comprehend how their own weapons had turned against them. In the aftermath, colonial authorities faced a new question: what to do with a dozen converted bioweapons that now seemed to consider humans their family. Mira sat with Shade in the observation chamber, while military officials and xenobiologists debated the creature's fate. "They're not weapons anymore," she said, when asked her opinion. "They're people. Weird alien people with different biology, but they can choose, and they chose us." The decision was made to integrate the creatures into colonial society, with each one remaining with the human who had bonded with them. It was unprecedented and risky, and would require completely new frameworks for understanding citizenship and rights. But humanity had never been good at following safe, predictable paths. They were much better at making friends in the strangest places. The news of New Verde's successful defense spread through human space faster than light-speed communications could carry it, traveling on colony ships and trade vessels, until every settlement knew about the girl who had turned weapons into guardians. Mira Chen became something she never wanted to be: famous. Her face appeared on broadcasts across dozens of worlds, and military strategists studied footage of her approach techniques, while xenobiologists wrote papers about the neurochemical bonding process. But fame meant nothing when the next wave of Vrick's attacks began. The alien empire had been humiliated by the failure on New Verde, and they responded with overwhelming force, deploying not just bioweapons, but full invasion fleets to 3 colonial worlds simultaneously. Mira watched the reports in her family's living quarters, while Shade dozed nearby, its patterns dim with what she'd learned to recognize as sadness or concern. The colonies of Far Ridge, New Kyoto, and Sultan's World were calling for help, but the human defense fleet was spread too thin. Each world was reporting dozens of bioweapon drops, and this time the Vricks had modified their deployment protocols. The new creatures were being released farther from population centers, and programmed to hunt in coordinated packs, rather than as individual killers. "They're learning from their mistakes," Mira's father said, reviewing tactical data with a group of colonial defense officers in their kitchen. "They know now that close contact with humans can turn the weapons, so they're keeping them isolated during the killing phase." Mira stood up so quickly that Shade's head snapped up in alarm. "Then we need to get to them before they complete that phase," she said, her mind already racing through possibilities. "We need to deploy human teams to those worlds, people who know how to approach the creatures." Commander Okoye, who had become a regular visitor since the invasion, shook her head. "We don't have enough transport capacity to move that many people between systems in time," she explained. "And we're talking about hundreds of bioweapons across 3 worlds. The numbers don't work." "What if we don't need to turn all of them?" Mira asked, moving to the tactical display and zooming in on Far Ridge. "What if we just need to turn enough to create a cascade effect?" She explained her theory using data from New Verde's experience. The bioweapons had a hive communication network that allowed them to coordinate hunting patterns. When Shade and the other converted creatures had broadcast their changed status through that network, it had created confusion and hesitation in the remaining weapons. "If we can convert a critical mass on each world, maybe 20%, their communication network could carry the bonding signals to the others," Mira continued. "The weapons would start receiving mixed messages, kill protocols from the Vricks, and safety signals from their converted siblings." Dr. Reeves pulled up neural scan data from the converted weapons on New Verde. "It's possible," she admitted slowly. "The creature's adaptive programming was designed to share tactical information, but we've observed that bonding experiences are also being transmitted through their network as a form of environmental data." What followed was the fastest mobilization of civilian volunteers in human military history. Young people from frontier colonies, those with experience handling dangerous alien wildlife, were recruited and given crash courses in bioweapon approach protocols. Mira insisted on going herself, and after hours of argument, her parents finally agreed on the condition that she would only operate in secured zones with full military support. She chose Far Ridge as her destination, because it was closest to New Verde and had the highest concentration of weapon deployments. Shade came with her, naturally, along with 3 other converted creatures and their human companions. The transport ship that carried them was a colonial military vessel retrofitted for rapid deployment. Mira spent the 3-day journey training with other volunteers, sharing everything she'd learned about reading the creature's body language and managing her own emotional state. The key is genuineness, she explained to a group of teenagers from the mining colonies. You can't fake compassion. The weapon's sensory systems are too sophisticated, and they'll detect deception in your biochemistry. A boy named Marcus raised his hand. What if I'm actually terrified? He asked honestly. These things were made to kill us. How do I not be afraid? You don't try to not be afraid, Mira said, thinking back to that first night with Shade. You acknowledge the fear, and then you choose curiosity instead. Wonder about what they're experiencing. Concern for their well-being. Interest in their nature. They arrived at Far Ridge to find a colony under siege. Bioweapons were systematically hunting through agricultural zones and outlying settlements, while the human population huddled in fortified structures. The defense forces had managed to kill 11 of the creatures, but at terrible cost. Conventional weapons could bring them down, but required sustained fire that often resulted in collateral damage. Commander Okoye's counterpart on Far Ridge, a grizzled veteran named Colonel Zong, was skeptical of the conversion plan. You want me to send children out to make friends with bioengineered killing machines while my world is being torn apart? He asked bluntly. I want you to try something that worked when conventional tactics failed, Mira replied with more confidence than she felt. Give us 3 days. If we can't convert enough weapons to make a difference, then go back to your original. The colonel agreed to a limited trial. Mira and 5 other volunteers were deployed to a zone where 3 bioweapons had been reported hunting in coordination. They went in at dawn, with Shade and the other converted creatures leading the way, moving through dense forest toward the sensor readings that marked their targets. The first contact happened faster than Mira expected. A bioweapon dropped from the canopy above, landing between her and the other volunteers, with patterns blazing aggressive red. But Shade was there immediately, interposing its bulk and making those complex sounds that Mira now understood as some form of communication. The wild weapon hesitated, and its tendrils waved in what might have been confusion. Mira stepped forward, with food in her hands, and started talking, explaining that fighting wasn't necessary, and that humans could be allies instead of prey. Red and amber. Then one of the other converted weapons, a creature bonded to a girl named Sarah from New Verde, added its voice to Shade's, creating a chorus of peaceful signals. The wild weapon's patterns shifted to amber, then to curious green. It approached slowly and accepted the food from Mira's hands. By sunset, they had converted all 3 weapons in the zone, and the neural scans showed the bonding information spreading through the hive network. Over the next 2 days, the pattern repeated across Far Ridge. Volunteer teams approached hunting packs, with converted weapons running interference, creating opportunities for human contact before the kill protocols could fully activate. Not every attempt succeeded, and the colony lost 4 volunteers to attacks that couldn't be stopped in time. But they converted 47 bioweapons out of the 83 that had been deployed. The tipping point came on the 3rd day, when the remaining, unconverted weapons began exhibiting hesitation behaviors. Their hive network was flooded with signals indicating that humans were safe, friendly, worth protecting. Some weapons simply stopped hunting and waited in confusion for instructions that made sense. Others sought out human contact on their own, drawn by the bonding signals their siblings were broadcasting. When the Vrix ground forces landed, expecting to find a decimated population, they instead faced a colony defended by an army of converted bioweapons fighting alongside human forces. The battle was short and decisive. The Vrix retreated within hours, leaving behind equipment and wounded soldiers in their haste to escape. Colonel Zhang stood with Mira on the colony's command platform and watched the enemy ships flee into orbit. "I owe you an apology," he said gruffly, "and probably my career. I almost refused to let you try." "You were protecting your people," Mira replied, watching Shade and the other creatures being celebrated by grateful colonists. That's what good commanders do. News of Far Ridge's success triggered a wave of similar operations on New Kyoto and Sultan's World. Within 2 weeks, all 3 colonies had successfully converted the majority of their bioweapon deployments. The Vrix Imperium's most expensive and sophisticated weapon system had been turned into humanity's newest allies through nothing more complicated than kindness and the willingness to see potential friends in deadly strangers. Military analysts across human space began updating their strategic doctrines, incorporating compassionate conversion as a legitimate defensive tactic. Xenobiologists rushed to understand the full implications of human neurochemistry's effect on Vrix biotechnology, and Mira Chen, still just 12 years old, found herself at the center of a revolution in how humanity approached potential threats. Feel like a revolutionary, though. She just felt like someone who had made a friend and helped others do the same. 2 years after the first bioweapon deployment, Mira stood before the Interspecies Council on humanity's diplomatic station orbiting Earth, and tried not to feel overwhelmed by the assembled representatives of a dozen alien civilizations. Shade rested beside her, no longer the injured creature she'd found in a crash crater, but a confident presence whose bioluminescent patterns pulsed calm blue. The council chamber was designed to accommodate wildly different biologies, with environments ranging from aquatic tanks to methane atmospheres separated by force fields. Mira had been invited, or summoned, depending on how you looked at it, to explain humanity's unprecedented and disturbing ability to subvert Vrix biotechnology. The Vrix themselves were notably absent, having withdrawn from most of known space after their bioweapon program had collapsed spectacularly across 17 colonial worlds. Ambassador Tiketh of the Silurian Consensus, a crystalline being that communicated through light pulses, began the questioning. "Mira Chen, your species has demonstrated an ability to reprogram hostile organisms through biochemical manipulation. Do humans intend to weaponize this capability against other civilizations?" Mira took a breath and reminded herself that she'd faced down bioweapons designed to kill her. So alien bureaucrats shouldn't be that intimidating. "We didn't manipulate anything," she replied, her voice amplified through the chamber's translation systems. "We just treated the creatures with kindness, and they responded. There was no trick or weapon involved." A hegemony representative, insectoid and chittering, transmitted its question through a translator. "Calmness is not a recognized military doctrine. Explain how compassion converts hostile bioforms when conventional warfare fails." "That's the whole point," Mira said, gesturing to Shade, who straightened to its full impressive height. "Warfare assumes everyone wants to fight, but the bioweapons were programmed to respond to human fear and aggression. When we offered friendship instead, their programming couldn't handle it." She pulled up holographic displays showing neural scan data from hundreds of converted creatures across human space. The Vrix built these weapons to be adaptive and responsive to human biochemistry, but they only tested them against frightened and hostile humans, Mira explained. They never considered what would happen if a human approached with genuine care. Dr. Reeves, attending as humanity's chief xenobiology expert, added supporting data. "The bonding process triggers oxytocin, dopamine, and other neurochemicals that humans naturally produce during social attachment," she said. The bioweapons sensory systems were designed to detect these chemicals, but interpreted them as environmental safety markers rather than threat indicators. So human emotional responses literally override hostile programming. Ambassador Taketh pulsed, its crystalline structure shimmering with what might have been fascination or alarm. In Vrix biotechnology, yes, Dr. Reeves confirmed. But we've begun to observe similar effects with other species. Humans seem to unconsciously emit bonding signals that many alien biologies respond to positively. This caused a stir among the assembled representatives. The creche delegate, amphibious and speaking through a vocoder, raised a limb. Are you suggesting humans can emotionally compromise any species they encounter? No, Mira interjected firmly. We're suggesting that humans are really good at making friends, if the other party is willing. Shade wasn't compromised. It was given a choice between killing or connecting, and it chose connection. She paused and looked around the chamber at the diverse array of alien forms. Isn't that what all of you did when you formed this council? You chose cooperation over conflict. We're just doing the same thing, maybe more instinctively than most species. The council session lasted for hours, as representatives questioned the implications of humanity's bonding abilities. Some civilizations saw it as a threat, while others viewed it as a potential diplomatic advantage. By the end, Mira was exhausted, but the council had reached a tentative conclusion. Humanity's approach to the Vrix bioweapons would be studied but not restricted, provided humans agreed to share their findings with the broader galactic community. Walking back through the station's corridors afterward, Mira's father put an arm around her shoulders. You did well in there, he said proudly. Not everyone can defend their entire species to a galactic council at 14. I just told them the truth, Mira replied, reaching out to run her hand along Shade's plating. We saw creatures that needed help, and we helped them. Understand why that's complicated. But she did understand, really. The galaxy was used to species that conquered through force, or manipulated through deception, or negotiated through careful calculation. Humanity's approach, leading with compassion and genuine interest in others, didn't fit established patterns. It made other species nervous because it was unpredictable and apparently very effective. Back on New Verde, where Mira still lived with her parents and Shade, the converted bioweapons had become integrated into colonial society in ways that surprised everyone. They served as emergency responders, using their strength and speed to reach disaster sites. They worked in agriculture, their sensory systems able to detect crop diseases and soil problems invisible to human technology. They even participated in education, with young children learning xenobiology by interacting directly with beings from another world. Something of a local celebrity, known for carrying lost children home and helping elderly residents with heavy tasks. Mira often found herself explaining to visitors that no, the creatures weren't pets or servants. They were people who'd chosen to be part of human communities. The Vrix Imperium never recovered from the bioweapon debacle. Their military doctrine had been built on the assumption that superior technology and ruthless efficiency would overcome any opposition. When a 12-year-old girl had dismantled their most advanced weapon system by being kind to it, something fundamental had broken in their strategic thinking. Some Vrix worlds began reaching out to humanity tentatively, curious about species that turned enemies into friends. Others retreated into isolation, unable to process the failure of their conquest-driven worldview. Mira watched these developments with interest, but her focus remained local. Protocols for approaching other, potentially hostile xenoforms. Training volunteers across human space in what the media had started calling the Chen method. On her 15th birthday, the colonial government presented her with an official title, Xenological Ambassador, with special focus on hostile to friendly species conversion. Shade had been beside her during the ceremony, patterns flashing proud gold, while children from the colony climbed on its back and decorated its plating with ribbons. Mira's mother had cried, and her father had given a speech about how humanity's future lay not in dominating the galaxy, but in befriending it. Later that night, sitting on the roof of her family's research station, with shade curled nearby and the stars bright overhead, Mira thought about how strange her life had become. She'd gone from a girl who liked studying alien animals to someone whose actions had changed military strategy across multiple civilizations. The core of it hadn't changed at all. She still approached every new creature with curiosity instead of fear. She still believed that most beings, given the choice, would prefer connection over conflict. And she still found the greatest satisfaction in those moments when something frightened and hostile relaxed and accepted help. Shade's tendrils brushed against her shoulder gently, and Mira leaned into the contact. "You know what the best part is?" she said softly, knowing Shade couldn't understand her words, but would pick up on her emotional state. "All those fancy ambassadors and military strategists are trying to figure out what makes humans special, what our advantage is." She smiled and scratched the ridge of chitin along Shade's neck. "But it's not complicated at all. We're just really, really good at loving weird things." The bioweapon-turned companion rumbled contentedly, and its patterns pulsed in rhythms that Mira had learned meant safety and home and family. Across human space, hundreds of converted creatures rested beside their human companions, living proof that humanity's greatest weapon had never been their technology or their tactics. It was their bizarre, irrational, absolutely unshakable belief that almost anything could become a friend if you just gave it a chance. The Vrix had sent Shade to kill Mira Chen. Instead, she'd given it a home, a name, and a family. And in doing so, she'd shown the galaxy that humanity's path to the stars would be paved not with conquest, but with the strangest, most powerful force in the universe, compassion, offered freely to those who'd never known it before. Years later, when historians analyzed the turning point in humanity's expansion through known space, they would point to the Battle of New Verde, or the conversion rates on Far Ridge, or the diplomatic implications of the Chen protocols. But Mira knew the real moment was simpler. It was a scared girl sitting down in front of a hurt creature and choosing to help instead of run. Everything else had just been that choice, repeated over and over, across worlds and species and situations. Because that's what humans did. They found the things everyone else called monsters, and they made friends.